Movie Pocket. Today we're discussing The Magnificent Ambersons, Orson Welles' second feature. And if you're wondering, where did the first half of that intro go? Well, it went with about 40% of this movie when Orson Welles filmed it, as RKO very famously cut and most likely destroyed a significant amount of the footage as Welles intended it after there were bad test screenings and Welles was off doing another film. And the legacy of this, the production behind The Magnificent Ambersons, has become something of a legend. But we'll talk about that. But really, we're here to talk about the film, as we always are. And we'll start the way we always do with our general thoughts. And you don't need to omit 40% of them. What do you guys think?
Well, I enjoyed this, but it's an enjoyment with a caveat because, like you mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned it at the outset of the episode, Christian, because I think it's impossible to not mention when talking about Magnificent Ambersons. I think it's really difficult to watch this movie without thinking about that missing footage and what could have been. And it's pretty apparent. I think it's really unfortunate in that the places where the missing footage is most evident is probably at the very beginning and the very end. So you both start the film and end the film thinking about what else it could have been if things had gone differently. I do think it's entertaining and it has the feel of a good Orson Welles movie. It has the ambiance of a good Orson Welles movie. Orson Welles was kind of known as like a boy wonder. He was very young when he made Citizen Kane. He was only 26, I think. But he was also, I think, a director with quite old-fashioned stylings. I don't think he saw himself as the wunderkind who was going to shake up Hollywood and bring on a new generation of young filmmakers. That was kind of the next generation with Coppola and Scorsese. I think he kind of, if anything, saw himself as like a younger Laurence Olivier, this filmmaker, actor, traditional dramatist. And I think that comes across here because this is a very traditional, old-fashioned movie. It's very much occupied with estates and wealth and aristocracy, these themes of kind of classic drama and literature, which Welles loved so much. And I think that comes across. Maybe I think it is a bit drier than some of his other material. And it is, even if those extra 40 minutes existed, I do wonder if maybe they would have been more of a curse than a blessing in some places, because even at 80 minutes, it's sometimes a little dull sitting with the Ambersons for a full feature film. But I was still entertained by it and came away giving it a 3 out of 5. I do think it's good, but there's just a lot of asterisks on that good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I saw a review online that compared this to just before Da Vinci starts showing off Mona Lisa, somebody goes up to it and spray paints a smiley face on it. And I thought that was a epic analogy because this was very mid. Very mid, very not Skibidi Toilet, very very there's a lot of Riz, and then yeah, it was very sad.
I did not think we would get that slang.
A lot of Riz and George hella cap, bro. Hella cap. And I'm very, very saddened by the fact that it's sad that you're more sad about what could have been with the characters' lives when they die than it is sad when they die. And that's very depressing. That's depressing on top. That's the freaking, I just was having coffee ice cream. That's the freaking chocolate syrup after the whipped cream, right? And I love whipped cream. But I did not know about this. I was living under some type of normie rock when I found out that there was some cut footage from this, but I immediately could tell because I felt like we were fast forwarding in time the whole time. It literally had the same pacing as Avengers Endgame when they're going back and getting the stones. It was that fast. And that was, it's just, it's you can tell that there was a lot of intent and care going into each scene, all the way from how it was shot to what emotions were meant to be conveyed. And then it just goes on to the next thing. And then you have that same experience over and over and over again, where it's like another life event happens. And then the last half gets even worse, where people are just terrible things are just straight up just coming out of nowhere. People are just dying and losing money and dating the wrong people, probably marrying the wrong people, obviously. And now I will say that relationship kind of back and forth thing with Isabel was not terribly confusing once I kind of started to see more of the heavy emotions come out later. So I started to piece that together. So I did appreciate that. Like, I could get enough of a sense of what relationship there was. It's just the big conflicts were far too many, and there was almost zero breathing time in the last half when it comes to like any sort of development, really. I mean, we're talking about like you could tell there was development. Like we everything off screen, clearly there is development, and then things just happen. And George is just like, I'm going to Europe with my mom. Bye. And she's like, okay. And then she faints, and it's sad. And then it's just like, boom, next thing. Oh, crap. Isabel's dead. Well, okay. Well, that's sad. And then obviously the ending, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
And also, I liked the theme of the automobile, but a lot of the way that it was implemented felt kind of shoehorned to me. It felt like there's a statement trying to be made about something where it really shouldn't have been, when there was this much intensity and back and forth between characters. It's kind of a weird topic. I understand it was supposed to be kind of integral to the conflict, especially with George, but like, once again, it kind of falls in that same category where it's like George hate car and Eugene love car. He make car big business, big win industry. And that's like the whole theme the entire time. And it takes a turn on its head later, as we find out. So there's a lot of inconsistencies. I'm glad I had like an experience with this, not knowing that RKO is the devil. And I'm really glad that it was brought up to me mostly after the fact. And yeah, it was a 3 out of 5. Clearly there's something amazing here, but it's really depressing how much of it was mellowed out by the editing. And there was no music credit because music doesn't exist and it has nothing to do with the hate towards RKO at all.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. I give this a 3 too, but in retrospect, I don't know if it really deserves it that much, because I already found myself forgetting so much about it. And when I say it doesn't deserve it, I mean all the same things that you two have said regarding the studio and not Wells, because there are moments of signature Wells style here that are nice, but it kind of flashed over me like a highlight reel. And even like reading about this plot and understanding that it was edited coming into this, I had picked this because I wanted to do a Wells film, but I didn't really want to do Citizen Kane. And I knew this was showing at the Cleveland Cinematheque, and I thought maybe I would see it there, but I ended up being in Maryland, so I couldn't anyway. And I had great trouble following things as they were happening. Great trouble. I had to reference plot summaries after the fact to sort of confirm my grounding, and even then I was still a little lost. I had trouble tracking who was mad at who and who was dying and who was a member of what family even. But the style's there. I like the music when it's there, even if it's not applied very well. But it is a sort of fascinating historical thing, and I want to give our audience maybe some more context there. So a big reason why this ended the way it did is Orson Welles was working simultaneously in Brazil on a film called It's All True, also for RKO. He was personally asked to do this by Nelson Rockefeller as part of the wartime good neighbor policy, which is fascinating. And I was watching a featurette about this on the Criterion Blu-ray I think this is the lowest I've rated a Criterion I've bought, but it still was a worthy purchase.
I
for
did think about that.
features.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they talk about how he was basically meant to make a propaganda film, an optimistic one that portrays relations and Brazil well. But once he got there, he became sort of fascinated with the deeply entrenched class divisions in Brazil between those with darker skin tending to be the poorer class. And that kind of became the thesis of his film and documenting that culture and that side of Brazil. And of course, RKO didn't love that either. But while all of this was happening, he didn't have access to the film, to what he had shot for The Magnificent Ambersons, because he was in Brazil and he couldn't very well go back. So Robert Wise comes in. We know Robert Wise from, we talked about The Sound of Music and West Side Story on this podcast. He directed both of those. It's probably what he's best known for. He also edited Citizen Kane. So, he's got a very worthy resume. But Wells kind of holds it against him to this day, he's dead. Held it against Wise. Yeah, in the afterlife. He thought that Wise's editing choices, though obviously brought forth by the studio and by some bad test screenings, he thought that they were manifest in part by his ambitions to direct himself. So that's an interesting footnote too. But all this strikes me as deeply tragic, the idea of making a film that is profoundly personal to you, especially after making something as iconoclastic as Citizen Kane and still just being given none of the decency to finish it. And when he was working on his film in Brazil, part of what RKO did to screw him over was lie to him about going over budget on his film in Brazil. They told him that he was over budget, but the books reflect that he was like $400,000 under budget. So there's a bunch of documented communications between higher ups in RKO and that corroborate this. So it's a fascinating story, perhaps more fascinating than the film here. But I mentioned it briefly. The music, Mitchell brought up that there's a missing music credit, but there is music here and there. Did you guys notice it? Did you like it? We like to talk about score sometimes on this podcast. What did you make of the music?
I definitely noticed the music in its being present. Look, the themes didn't really stick with me. I think of the kind of oral soundscape. What stuck with me most is Orson Welles' narration. Because he previously adapted this, I read, for radio. The novel he adapted to like an hour long, which he did with Mercury Theater as a radio production. And so I think he's bringing a lot of that kind of voice and those instincts here as well. He definitely has a voice for radio, and I do think his narration is really doom-laden in a way that works for his intentions for the story. And the score, I think, is fine, but it sounds like something that you would find in a period piece of this era. It's kind of jaunty and I don't want to say stock, but it does. You can hear the session musicians is what I'll say. It certainly doesn't leave an impression in the way that many of this composer, who we're not naming, other works have done so.
I'll say the ballroom scene was pretty engaging. There's a lot of depth to it, and I feel like the music was much more than just supplemental in that regard. Every other regard, it was all the way up to like the much needed newspaper montage. You always must have a zoomed in newspaper at some point. And I forget what it sounded like. I could not tell you what it sounded like, but it's like, stuff's happening. Stuff happening music. Yeah. That's what's happening. Other than that, didn't really recognize it too much. I'm sure there must have been some epic pieces that were missing in the other cuts. So, Christian, please educate us.
I don't know. I know that Orson Welles has detailed what was cut, but I admittedly did not spend a ton of time looking at his own designs or his reflections on what he wanted the film to be. In part because a very small part of me hopes that the underling at RKO tasked with destroying the footage didn't, and maybe it's just sitting in a basement in New Mexico somewhere, and we just don't know about it, and maybe it'll get discovered when we're 70 and we can watch the full Magnificent Ambersons. That's my hope. Probably not a very productive
Cookie
or
Pocket
realistic.
Powers. Cookie Pocket Powers.
Yes.
Or 4K restoration of the original coming out
Yes,
right now.
We're manifesting. We have a pretty good track record of like a week after we record an episode, Kino Lorber or somebody announces a 4K restoration of what we reviewed.
Yeah.
So
Or somebody dies.
Yeah,
One of those two.
music.
Yes.
I like what I heard. I don't blame him for wanting his name off of it, and I feel like it's sort of impossible to talk about this without talking about the footage, because you write the score for film is meant for not just for the movie at large, but for the specific scenes and moments in a movie. And when that gets moved around, your intention as a musician is almost entirely lost. So I imagine that in particular this optimistic ending that Wells didn't intend, and I'm guessing Bernard Herrmann didn't score for, the music there feels strange, and that whole ending feels very strange. But I do like the style of the music and what it's going for. I like this sort of session musician. I like the sort of tinniness of the sound of that small orchestra when the microphones weren't really that great in the 40s or whatever. I think there's a charm to that. So
His name is Voldemort.
I think that sound is charming as well. It's just I was surprised to hear that from Bernard Herrmann, or maybe not from Bernard Herrmann, maybe from the stock music that replaced Bernard Herrmann. But because since his music, the themes for Psycho, Taxi Driver, Obsession, Sisters, The Birds, countless others, all have very identifiable riffs that feel very authorial and written in his, as opposed to this, which kind of feels like the filler.
Yeah. Characters. I love characters. I love talking about characters. And in a story like this, which I guess Wells wanted to be a tragic story, but ended up not being so, it's still about character desires and relationships. Specifically, Eugene Morgan wants to marry Isabel. She goes for another guy. But then Eugene's back. Oh my gosh. This is basically the synopsis of the film to those that haven't seen it. But we talked about how things felt rushed and the pace was strange. Did the romance or lack thereof work for you? Did you feel that you got a solid performance from, it was Joseph Cotton was Eugene, right? Yes. Who I guess Joseph Cotton was also Orson Welles' very close friend at the time, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But, what did we make of the performances, and did certain relationships work better for you or feel less damaged by the edit we got?
We keep coming back to the cuts, but again, it's impossible not to talk about them when it comes to basically any aspect of the film. And also, I think this ties into the automobile angle as well, because I have not read Booth Tarkington's novel, and perhaps there's an existing script which indicates what Wells wanted to do with this story before it was trimmed down. But I very much got the impression from where the obvious cuts are that we were probably meant to get a lot more of Eugene at the beginning of the film. And I got the impression that Eugene and George were kind of meant to be more rival protagonists than they are. Because as it is, George is kind of our lead, and Eugene is this figure who appears to challenge him every now and then. But I very much got the impression that we were kind of meant to be rooting for both of them in a way, despite maybe not necessarily loving either of them. And I think a lot of that rooting would have come from stuff with Eugene that would have happened at the beginning of the story. And as is, the movie, I think, mostly leaves you rooting for or invested in George's downfall. But even then, that shoots itself in the foot with the ending that exists in this version of the film. The romances, I didn't really find myself all that gripped by, because maybe this is a result of the edits, or maybe it's also just a result of the time, but the women don't really feel very present. They kind of just feel like extensions of the men in their life. Eugene, so Eugene's daughter kind of just feels like an extension of him. And there's that scene where she's talking about the obvious metaphor of there was a Native American chief who was obnoxious, and they pushed him out to sea on a canoe and they let him go. And that's clearly meant to be a metaphor for her relationship with George. But I didn't really feel any sadness for her, at least in that situation, because we didn't really get to see much of her side of the relationship, or certainly nothing all that personal and memorable. Pretty much everything we see is from George, who's a miserable old goat his whole life anyway. So yeah,
Old goat.
there were lots of things that I liked, and this kind of story I don't mind. I honestly think that this kind of story and this film in and of itself has been pretty influential. I can think of a lot of movies that have been pretty big within the last 20 years or so that I see a lot of this in. I think the conclusion of There Will Be Blood definitely owes some influence to the Magnificent Ambersons. I definitely, I mean, say what you will about it, I wasn't a huge fan of it, but last year's Saltburn, which was a huge hit, I definitely think there's some Magnificent Ambersons influence in that. And I think a lot of that does come down to the relationships between the characters and one character's death leading to another character's downfall. But yeah, a lot of the connective tissue is just snipped out. So you have the moments, but you don't really have a feeling of the relationships that tie them together.
It's like the entire film is like a memory. Like the things that you would remember most from the film are what are left in. Yeah. Like if you were trying to tell like a synopsis without showing the details, these are the clips that you would show describing the movie. And it's really weird because it's not like the film is necessarily short, but it just has so many big moments, so much. I don't want to say it's saying, but it is trying to say, and oftentimes can't really accomplish fully. I mean, I couldn't tell you, like, I remember the two most important scenes out of how many scenes with Lucy and George, where George is trying to be with her, and then she just kind of never makes up her mind about it until later, and until she ends with this quote. So it's like you just get the down and dirty, like, what happened? Well, I didn't really know what to do, and he's obnoxious. That's basically what she was saying. And meanwhile, there's like however much, probably tens of thousands of dollars being lost, and people dying and mismanaging finances all of a sudden, and like it's, but the scenes are so well acted. And they're so passionate about it. It's like you met these people for the first time, and you're kind of waiting for them to tell you how they got up to this point. Like showing a random funny moment with your friends, and you like send them like a Snapchat or something, and then and you're like, how did this happen? Like, why are they stripping naked and throwing things off the balcony? How did we get to this point? And you're but you just accept it as what it is. Because it was so well acted, it was so funny, you must know they must have been heavily drinking up to this point. And we don't get any of that kind of context here. And it's very depressing. And I will say with George, I didn't really feel inclined to root for him as much until I felt like he was being more honest with himself later, as compared to when they were a kid. They're kind of setting him up to be a liar, where in this he was kind of just mega stubborn about everything and was just totally committed in protecting his family and protecting tradition and stuff. And I just felt like that was, considering we had a lot of screen time with him too, obviously it lends a lot more to his character development. But I really enjoyed him as a character. And I will say, like, with Eugene, I feel like we got the least. And I'll definitely second what Zach said. We didn't really get much of, besides Fanny, that we didn't really get any exposure to the women much at all. Like considering this is supposed to be like an aristocratic family that owns everything everywhere in the town, and how influential they are, we're just assuming that they're influential. We're just assuming like, oh, they just had an estate. Oh, it's just like not worth anything anymore. Or like, how they got to this point, or anything. We just don't get any context about it. Which in theory could be engaging, because then we could figure it out on our own. But considering there was so much feeling, so much like reaction, as if we were already supposed to be invested in the relationships, that's where the cuts really cut deep. And that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, the movie very much feels in its current form like it's meant to be the tragedy of George, which sounds like an arc from Seinfeld. But
what are you talking about?
It is that. But there are key things, I think, that aren't there. Like the idea that the Amberson estate is worthless now. I feel like we don't really see how that happened, or why. And maybe there's is he a colonel? Is he the Amberson
Major?
Patriarch? Maybe he's one of
I've
those.
always got the rings.
He's one of those fake millionaires that aren't really worth anything, but they have kind of the reputation and the connections to hold themselves up. But so once he dies, maybe that all falls apart. But it would have been nice to see that if that was the case, rather than getting a close up on the actor giving a pretty good sort of Kuleshov effect performance in that moment. But we just kind of, and he died. And
he was speaking the lyrics of the Wish song we were talking about.
Oh no.
And the sun and the earth.
Oh Lord. Yeah. I think one of those like big emotional moments that is well acted, that feels like it should hit like a ton of bricks, but it doesn't because of the context, is that one scene with Lucy when is she like saying goodbye to George? I don't even remember exactly how it plays out.
Yes.
But that feels like it should be such a moment, but we don't really arrive so much as we're teleported there.
Well, it plays like she's putting on a brave face because she knows this relationship has to end, and she loves him, but she has to let him go,
right?
Because he would be like a ball and chain around her ankle in a lake. But we don't know anything about Lucy in that moment, so we don't get that. And then I think that when she faints off camera in the drugstore, that's the last we ever see of her in the whole movie.
Zach, what do you name one thing you know about Lucy?
She wears a hat.
Oh, hey, you passed the test.
Christian, name one thing you know about Lucy besides that.
She is related to Eugene. Yeah.
She's emotional and she doesn't know what she wants.
Yes. Well,
there we go.
I will say, in partial defense of Zach's fair point about the women and their roles here, is I thought that Fanny and Agnes Moorehead's performance was interesting, and her sort of manic episodes made me really uncomfortable and made me go, oh, I don't like that. And then I was like, I'm not supposed to like it. And that's Orson Welles being daring with his style, especially in the time period.
There is a really interesting story that she told like years later about the scene where she like collapses up against the water heater or whatever. Yeah. And she has this reaction of, I've lost all of our money on bad investments. I'm Seinfeld. But apparently they did like 8 different takes of that. And she said that Orson Welles told her to do one like she was like a child throwing a temper tantrum, and one angry, and one afraid, and one nearly bursting into tears. And she apparently on set was thinking, are we done? Like, can we be over with this? And then he asked her to do like an 8th one with no direction at all. And it kind of became this weird blend of all of them, which I do think comes across in that moment. I think that's one of the strongest performed moments of the movie as it exists.
For sure.
Totally. Yeah. Well, we're winding down here. I'm trying to think of questions that aren't about the edit, and I don't think they exist. I will ask you to do one or both of talk about the ending and why it does or doesn't work, And I'm going to be the moderator of the 2016 presidential debate and ask you, because we've ragged so much on a 3-star movie that we've all given 3 stars. I'm going to ask you to say one nice thing about the Magnificent Ambersons.
I love Zach's children. I respect his children.
Well, I'm going to. This is my favorite movie. It's the best movie. We have the most magnificent Ambersons here at Cookie Pocket. I'm going to kind of do both in one, because I will say I think a fantastic ending exists in this movie as it is currently edited. This movie would have an amazing ending if George found out that he and Fanny were on their own. They don't have any money. He can't go into law, a supposedly respectable profession from his perspective at least. And he has to take higher paying but less respectable work in an explosives factory. He goes back to the house one last time and prays beside his mother's bed. And we end with that Orson Welles narration of everyone always wanted George to get his comeuppance, and now he had it. Fade to black, credits. That's really dark, but I think would be an amazing ending. But instead, we get what one Letterboxd user who I follow refers to as a Poochie went back to his home planet ending, where we get like one shot in a hospital where Eugene and Fanny are walking by, and Eugene goes, yeah, George and I are like totally friends now. We shook hands. He agreed I'm an awesome guy, and I said he was pretty cool too, and I'm going to help you guys out. Isn't that cool? Bye, audience. And it feels so disingenuous and totally against the intentions of what Orson Welles has been laying down the whole movie, despite the fact that that is apparently closer to what happens in the book. But I have to imagine if that is how the book ends, there's more setup for it. And it probably feels more natural in this celebrated book than it does in this movie, where our lead character gets blown up off screen and appears in the final shot behind the door of a hospital room.
I'll say that there is a hint or two of a Eugene Fanny relationship, and it's not completely unheard of. And I would accept it under some circumstances if there was a lot more explanation and character development leading in that direction. I'll also say that on paper, it doesn't sound like the absolute worst out of left field idea to have kind of the entire old aristocratic family fall apart and then have like a new progressive moving forward family start from nothing. Like conceptually, that kind of sounds right. It's just when, as we've all alluded to, as everybody alludes to, it seems like on the internet, the rest of the film does not support that theme at all. I'm much more inclined to be on Zach's side with that in terms of just having it just straight up go to the end, especially with how much rejection there was towards the automobile theme. And I also think that having it end on a one note kind of depressed, just straight linear down into depression theme, that tone, that would lend a lot more to the integration of the family falling apart emotionally and the automobile, like, new society, the golden Aragon theme. Yeah, I don't think there's really much else to say. The ending is poopy.
The more we talk about this, the more I'm actually intrigued with the idea of rewatching it, because now that we've sort of done the work, I feel like I might be able to enjoy those moments, however disconnected and underdeveloped they are, more. On the ending, I think its rosiness is out of left field, but I think what bothers me the most is not even necessarily Eugene and Fanny, but just that it doesn't feel like to me that he's genuinely thinking about Isabel or Lucy at all in that moment. And that to me, that just feels like a total betrayal of his character.
But Isabel's spirit came to me through George. He spoke to me like the door knocker in Christmas Carol. Jacob.
Yeah. By the way, that sequence was not shot by Wells. I'm sure you knew that. But The nice thing I'll say is that opening sequence with the, what do they call it? The shindig, the ballroom. What do they call that? There's a word. There's a word for it. It's
party?
No, it's like a serenade.
Partay.
A serenade.
Oh, okay.
That's what they called it.
Yes.
Yeah, so that bit where it like
shindig.
moves. Dude, I was fishing. It started with an S. That wasn't too bad. That camera movement is my favorite in the movie. And apparently it took them days to set that up, and nobody else was doing that in this decade. So Orson Welles still rocks.
I did want to. I mean, in addition to all the ways that RKO screwed Orson Welles on this production, it sounds like they also kind of laughed all the way to the bank, because the Amberson house, they apparently built as like a full house with moving walls to support camera movements and everything like that. And they just kept that, and they used that for like the next 15 or 20 years on a whole bunch of movies as just free set.
No way.
Which I'm sure they were very grateful for, because RKO kind of hit hard times in the following decade. And I think by the 60s, they shut their doors, but crank out a couple of horror movies in the Amberson house and make some quick money.
They were grateful for it after they were outwardly furious with Wells for going over budget. And then, of course, it ended up being to their benefit. But, what are you going to do? We can review. Are we doing our Lynch-a-thon, David?
Yeah.
I'll say one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
This ending made less sense than the end of The Mist. And that's all I'll say.
I will actually concede that. I will give you that, Mitchell. Over that very low bar.
And I like the ending of The Mist, so that's no skin off my nose.
Oh, no. Or your entire head. All right.
Okay.
Dick Laurent is dead.
Dick Laurent is
Yeah. So I guess some context for our audience. Ever since we've kind of formed this friend group that makes up the podcast, we've been getting together for movie nights every now and then. And a movie night that's been on the books for a very long time, and we've tried to do it like 5 or 6 times and finally managed to get it done this past weekend, is David Lynch night. Originally, the lineup was going to be The Elephant Man, Blue Velvet, and Lost Highway. We ended up just doing The Elephant Man and Lost Highway. So instead of a pool that kind of gradually declines into a deep end, it's more like a pool where you're in the shallow end and there's just a harsh drop directly into the deep end. This is a drowning pool. So yeah, I guess we could tackle either. What do you guys fancy discussing on The Elephant Man or Lost Highway?
Well, I can jump in on Elephant Man, I think.
Yeah.
I was probably anticipating it more going in. I ended up liking it a lot, but less than the other one. It's kind of funny to me, though, because coming home, my parents are always like, oh, what movie did you watch? And I was like, oh, we watched The Elephant Man. And my mom was kind of like, David Lynch directed The Elephant Man? I'm like, what? That's like a famous movie, I think, is literally the sentence she said. But what she meant when she said that was, this is like a well-regarded, artful, sympathetic movie, and isn't David Lynch the like weirdo jerk that likes to kill in weird ways and do this and that? And it's like, no, Elephant Man is a super sympathetic and thoughtful movie. I think Mitchell's review kind of covers it well in this respect. I think my biggest drawback from it is most, if not all, of the characters feel very static, and with that lack of change, I felt it felt maybe more of a chore to sit through. It wasn't a chore, but maybe less rewatchable than something like Lost Highway is.
Right.
I landed on a 3.5 for Elephant Man.
Yeah, me and Christian were talking about that on the car ride home, and we were talking about how Elephant Man is like super unwatchable again compared to Lost Highway, where you can watch it like 20 times and still not get everything out of it. Anthony Hopkins is epic. I would dare say he was better in this than Thor.
I would dare say that as well.
You got me, man. You got me.
John Hurt better in this than Sleepy Hollow.
God, he was in that.
He was digging deep.
Yeah. So it was very well constructed, very believable, honestly. Really, you can apply 1,000 different lenses to it very effectively. And I think that makes for and of how well acted it is. And I think that just makes for how universally acceptable it is, how very, not, I wouldn't say it's very digestible. It's like food poisoning, because you eat your favorite food and then you want to throw up the next day kind of thing, which is a good thing because the food was really good, but you feel depressed. It's very depressing, right? You like my analogies today? I think I'm on a roll, right?
Yeah.
I do, yes.
So yeah, I there's really not a lot to say about it. I think it's just a very accessible film. It really does tell a very emotional story in a very zany environment, like a very weird, like Elephant Man. What is that? But it really kind of you just accept it super quickly. Lost Highway, there's 1,000 million different things you can accept, but we'll go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I mean, clearly Elephant Man was the appetizer to the Lost Highway entree of the evening.
Yes,
but
yes,
I do really love the Elephant Man. I do think that it's notable that it kind of, I would argue, it sort of invented the whole modern hardship biopic genre, because there have been a lot of movies like this, I think, since then, about somebody has a disability or a facial deformity, and there's one person who's going to support them. You think of movies like Mask, by Peter Bogdanovich, Wonder, which came out about a decade ago, and a lot of these films do revolve around people with elephantitis or lionitis, because those happen to be conditions that result in that kind of facial condition. But I mean, I think John Hurt is really amazing in it. He gives a very, very sympathetic performance through what has to have been an incredibly unwieldy amount of makeup. And the fact that he gets emotion and a personality and a performance out of that, I think is really striking. And it's not like the most quoted, but it shows up in a ton of movies as something that's like playing on a TV screen or something. The scene where he's cornered in the men's bathroom in the train station and has his I'm not an animal, I'm a man, I'm a human being, his kind of profound scream of rage against and defiance against a world that has never understood him and maybe never will. And I think that's a really beautiful moment. And David Lynch was nominated, I think, for Best Director for this, which I think it's an unconventional choice, but I do think you can nominate someone for Best Director for a bunch of different things, for the way they deal with actors, for the way they craft a film visually. I think that in terms of crafting an all-around kind of atmosphere and aura, that's what David Lynch really excels at. And I think his work in The Elephant Man does deserve that nomination, though he didn't win. David Lynch is one of the great directors who, at least till now, has only ever received an honorary Academy Award. But anyway, Lost Highway. We'll talk about the real meat and potatoes of the evening.
Yeah.
John Hurt was not in Sleepy Hollow, but Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
Oh yeah, well, definitely better than
that's what I meant.
The Crystal Skull.
Go ahead, Christian.
I just assumed he was in the assemblage of old British men in Sleepy Hollow.
I get them all mixed
totally
up.
Could have gotten away with
I think that's Michael Gough, who plays.
It is
Alfred
Michael Gough.
in the
You're totally right.
Burton Batman films. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we all had different levels of Lynch knowledge. We talked about Lynch's Dune, I guess, twice on the podcast, which is the only film we've really done that for. But I mean, Zach obviously knew Lynch really well. Mitchell, had you seen any other Lynch other than Dune before this night?
No, I only ever wanted to see Dune.
You really can't be blamed for that. Oh gosh. Well, I sort of eased my way into Lynch. I had seen obviously Dune, and he has a shorter film called What Did Jack Do, which I think is on Netflix, and it's him interrogating a monkey. It's fun. And I had seen The Straight Story, which is another sort of, at least feels more of a conventional sympathetic story than one might stereotypically assume Lynch makes. But Lost Highway, I mean, what can you say about Lost Highway? It's one of those movies that you really kind of love or hate, I think. It makes unconventional things like something like Christopher Nolan's Memento feel pretty tame by comparison, I think, both in construction and in thesis. And while we were watching this, we were maybe like 2/3 of the way through the movie, and we don't movie talk a lot, but we get our little words in here and there. And I do a lot of what the heck is going on, Zach, or variations on that. And I don't know if Mitchell or Zach said something about not getting something literal or getting an answer to the story. And I don't remember what I said. Like, I didn't need an answer. I didn't need...
But you needed something.
I needed
remember
something.
That, yeah.
Yes. And I totally think Lost Highway gives you something, even if it's not literal, even if it's not what you're looking for. I think if you're trying to grapple with something that has a purpose and a meaning, and you're open-minded, and you like Patricia Arquette, you're in for a good time.
In all the ways.
Yeah, I think the mistake a lot of people make when they come to a David Lynch movie is that they see it like they would see any other quote unquote confusing movie, something like Memento or Inception, where they look at it like a Rubik's Cube. There's a solution. I have to figure this out. And I don't think that is a practical way to watch David Lynch movies, because David Lynch didn't originally start as a filmmaker. He was a painter. And the only reason he started making animations and short films is because he as he said it, he wanted to bring his paintings to life. So I think a lot of the way you approach a David Lynch movie has to resemble the way you would approach an abstract painting. Like I said in my Letterboxd review of Lost Highway, when I look at a Jackson Pollock, I don't ask where the nose is. When you look at abstract artwork, the point isn't to figure it out. It's to bring yourself to it and see what you get out of it based on that. And so I think that's one of the main reasons I think that Lynch refuses to talk about like the meaning of his films. And it definitely means something to him there, but he just doesn't want to get into like what does it mean? Because I think that encourages too literal of a reading of his work. There's an interview, a pretty famous interview with Mark Kermode, the British film critic, where they're talking on stage and David Lynch says, "Believe it or not, Eraserhead is actually my most spiritual film." And Mark Kermode goes, "Oh, really? Well, elaborate on that." And David Lynch goes, "No." Which I think is a great attitude to have as an abstract artist. Personally, I see Lost Highway as, I think we start with the third act, and then the second half after he turns into Balthazar Getty are like the first two acts. So we're seeing a story totally out of order. But how I feel about it could be totally different to what you guys think is the meaning of it. And I think that's the point. And I enjoy that personally.
Yeah, having that painting context is extremely important, I think. There's definitely... So obviously, especially nowadays, a lot of things are just left to interpretation because you can. Because it's an easiest excuse.
Because you haven't thought of the answer yourself.
Right. Because or just making excuses about whatever. Like it's like answer is E, all the above, or none of the above, and you just move on, right? And your Scantron, you get like 5 in a row, and you're like, I gotta be wrong. But if in the case of this, I had to think of Tenet, unfortunately, because Tenet is a great example of making excuses for the sake of the story. Now, it doesn't mean that Tenet doesn't have its own substance in it, and there is a lot to analyze in it, but I will not fervently defend that at this time. But I will say that Lost Highway is very much like a bunch of paintings and a bunch of interpretive art, and the connecting fiber is trying to understand each scene, I guess. And there's like some very subtle connection to each scene, but a lot of it you can pick up on your own, or you can leave it to like, it's just like it's supposed to be a nightmare sequence, or there's, I forget what the theory was. I read online about it, but it was like coming back around, like insanity is like you come back to reality. Oop, there goes gravity. And you have, you're going from whatever like the reality is, and you have this crazy sequence, and then you're brought back again. That's why it's called Lost Highway. And I think that is a super creative way of filmmaking. It does not feel linear at all, but that connecting fiber I was talking about, like the mystery aspect to it, the piecing together the puzzle that's not really there, is what makes it so engaging, because you keep getting convinced that there's some reality going on, that there's something to hang on to. And ultimately it all kind of crumbles, especially in the last 20 minutes or so. And they play Rammstein again, and you realize that they're playing it again. This cannot be real. You only hear it once usually. And and yeah, I just thought that was really great. Some super convincing acting. It was just very, it wasn't trippy. It wasn't trippy. It wasn't like you're in a dream the whole time. It wasn't like you're going in and out of reality a lot. It was kind of just like, it was kind of a limbo. Like you're always in a limbo of like trying to understand where you are and what's happening. And it makes it more compelling than it does like, oh, this is just like an excuse, or this is just, being lazy. There's zero, I saw nothing pretty much lazy about this, honestly.
And I think you can also I think it is possible to just watch it and appreciate it as like a horror movie, as a nightmare. Because like the scene with the stranger at the party, whereas I'm in your house right now.
Oh my God.
Is like one of the most disturbing scenes I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And that's just stands, I think, on its own as like a perfect little horror short film where he calls home and the guy actually picks up despite being right in front of him right now.
Yeah, I think my last point of praise for Lost Highway would be, I feel like I've gotten to the point, both on this podcast and my own searches and in other things Zach and others have exposed me to. I'm reaching the point where there are very few genuine original things, or things that are not derivative or of the same genre or method of filmmaking. And this, I can't think of the last time that I watched something and struggled to think of like a single reference point for it. Like it is, Lost Highway is truly, maybe not next to other David Lynch films, but to me, who had only seen his more comparatively tame works, it feels truly without a point of comparison and genuinely totally creative. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
Okay. You better run, Zach.
Wow.
Yes.
I'm gonna send you home to mother in a cardboard box.
Okay, Mitchell, you're starting, and are you ready?
I can't believe Zach was tailgating me. I'm about to go 200 miles an hour into him.
Do you have any idea how many people die on the highway every year?
I read. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt the rundown. You can slow down a little bit, Zach. I heard that what the heck's his name was actually raging in that scene. Like he was actually mad. I don't know
Robert Loggia.
That's so funny.
Robert Loggia was actually like genuinely frustrated with some directing decision, and he was just like acting out his rage, and Lynch like turned on the cameras or something. I'm not sure about that, but
That's so funny.
sounds good.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. Yeah. 3, 2, 1, go.
RKO.
4 out of 5.
Being jealous of your girl's father.
3 out of 5.
Fashion history.
2 out of 5.
Always having a member of the family in Congress.
3 out of 5.
Everybody knowing everybody.
3 out of 5.
Studying college at school.
4 out of 5.
His comeuppance.
4 out of 5.
Orson Welles' visual style.
4 out of 5.
School knocking the stuffing out of you.
3 out of 5.
The snowbank as a featherbed.
3 out of 5.
Releasing a film without 40% of its intended footage.
2 out of 5.
Destroying the footage cut from theatrical release.
2 out of 5.
Studying college and school.
4 out of 5.
Aunt Fanny hysteria.
3 out of 5.
Being the prettiest and queerest.
2 out of 5.
Getting a horse.
2 out of 5.
Getting a horseless carriage.
2 out of 5.
Prize bachelors showing their haberdashery.
2 out of 5.
Kicking old Fanny.
2 out of 5.
Promising not to get blown up.
3 out of 5.
Getting run over instead.
4 out of 5.
2 seconds. Being a defendant in a libel suit.
3 out of
Time.
Oh,
Ooh.
clean.
Usually I'm not the last one. Oh, I don't like that.
It's stressful. Stressful.
Who's next?
Mitchell.
Oh,
But on a kazoo.
Sam Neill and Laura Dern, Mitchell? Could it be?
We must be talking about the masterpiece of Jurassic Park #1. We must be, right, Christian?
I sure hope so.
Nope.
Oh,
You thought we were lost on the highway. The whole world's getting lost on Isla Nublar.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over for us now. Ian Malcolm, favorite character.
yeah.
Yeah, we're doing Jurassic Park. Lost World Jurassic Park, I think is the official title.
Number 2.
Number 2. The second one out of the... There's three.
There
There may be 3 more. Who knows?
Dear God. I rewatched the original in preparation for this, which I greatly enjoyed, but it actually, I think I'm going to like this even less. I tried watching this sequel maybe 2 years ago, and I watched about 40 minutes and turned it off, and I basically never do that. So we'll see, Mitchell. We'll see.
You don't understand chaos theory.
Had you never seen it before then, Christian?
Not the first one I had seen once in like middle school, maybe. It's been a really long time, but I watched the sequel with basically no context other than vague knowledge of the first one. So now that I've rewatched the first one now, so I'll be going in with more context this time.
See, I'm actually quite excited for this because a couple months ago, I went up to New York for a film festival, and the hostel I was staying in the lobby, they were playing the Jurassic Park trilogy on a projector against the wall with the subtitles on. It was silent. So, but I just sat there for like a couple hours, lapsing in and out of the first movie and Lost World. And I was like in total silence, just watching the shots. I was like, is this movie better than I remember? So I'm kind of pumped to check this out. Yeah.
Our first Spielberg film. I was very alarmed that we had yet to have one. This is our first out of all of the choices.
All the choices.
I chose this one. Have a good time, folks.
Yeah.
Have a good time.
Here we go.
It's not M. Night Shyamalan.
Yes.
Just be happy about that.
Well, I've made my peace with Jeff Goldblum, and I'm turning away from Laura Dern and towards Julianne Moore, and I guess we'll say more next time.